I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, downtown, the old medical center. I was born down there, the old downtown when it was mostly Latinos and blacks, you know what I'm saying? Downtown Jersey City, if you're familiar with the area. We used to live on 6th Street between Erie and Manila. For those of you that know, that's right next to the Roberto Clemente baseball field. At a young age, 8 or 9 years old, we moved to Bayonne, New Jersey on 25th Street. Well, between 24th and 25th on the boulevard. Lived there for the majority of my youth and my teenage years. My mother had me at a young age, you know. My mother had me at 18 or 19 years old. She was still in high school, about to graduate high school when she became pregnant with me. She went and told my grandmother being the old school mentality, being the strict mentality that she was at the time, she told my mother, you know, you gotta leave, you gotta find your own way. I'm not gonna be raising your children. My mother was still in high school. She had just graduated. She graduated from Ferris High School in Jersey City. She had to make a decision what she was gonna do. And my mother, one day we had a conversation and I asked my mother, I said, Ma, did you ever think about having an abortion at that time? Because I knew you were so young. My biological father abandoned my mother. I don't know how old I was. I believe it happened before I was even born, if I'm not mistaken. So my mother had to fend for herself at a very young age. My mother had to move to Boston. She had to go out there and stay with my father's side of the family just to survive. It wasn't comfortable for my mother over there. You know, there was a lot of people over there. There was a lot of people in and out of the house from what I heard. My mother ended up moving back to Jersey City. She had to starve in order to feed me. My mother would sacrifice her own well-being just to make sure I had something to eat, just to make sure I had clothing, diapers, formula, food. My mother grew up in a volatile household, very strict when I was growing up. It was tough, you know, and I blame that on her upbringing. You know, my mother grew up in a household that was lacking love, that was lacking affection, and I believe that affected her, you know, as she became an adult and as she became a mother. I was her first child. My grandfather had some inner demons that he dealt with. You know, my grandfather had a drinking problem. He had a verbal abuse problem. You know, he was violent at times. My mother grew up in a household, you know, it was her and 3 other siblings, 2 sisters and 1 brother. My Uncle Robert was the oldest. Most of the time, my uncle was on the receiving end of my grandfather's rampages when he was drunk. My uncle suffered a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of physical abuse at the hands of my grandfather. My grandfather was a great musician. I remember days that I would sing with him. I remember staying with him a lot in New York. My grandfather used to be the super of a big building in New York. I believe it was in Manhattan. Unfortunately, my grandfather passed away at the age of 76. I was able to, you know, have some final words with him and go see him in the hospital in Florida, which was a tragic moment for me because it's the first time that I ever lost somebody close to me. My mother met my stepfather, Wilbert Estrella, in Jersey City when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And I grew to love him at a young age very quickly. And he took me to a barbershop named, at the time it was called, in downtown Jersey City, the barbershop was called Chato's. My father used to take me there for haircuts, and one day I called him Dad. And to the day he passed away, he remembered that. My father was a good guy, man. My father was a disciplinarian, he was tough. I mean, you know, would tell you how it is, you know, didn't have any hair on his tongue. He would keep it real and he would tell you how he felt. He didn't care what your status was. He didn't care where you came from. He didn't care who you were. My father was always going to be authentic, and that's why I respected him so much, because he had such great character, you know what I'm saying? And he was one of those people, you either loved him or hated him, you know? There was no gray area. You either loved my dad or hated him, and I come to find out that most people loved him. You know, my father would give of himself. He would give the shirt off his back just to see people succeed, especially his children. My father unfortunately passed away February 15th of this year, 2020. He committed suicide in his house. It affected me because I spoke to my father the night before Valentine's, and you know, my father left me a suicide note. He left a suicide note for everybody. He left one for me, my sister, his wife. It really hurt me, man. It really devastated me to know that I no longer was going to be able to physically see my father, and to tell him I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not being the best son that I possibly could have been. There were days that I tell him, Dad, I'm gonna come check you out, and I wouldn't show up. There were days that, you know, he was struggling with depression, and I was working, and I was too tired the next morning to go spend time with him, and I will forever live with that regret. My father left me a note before he committed suicide, and he said, I know you love me, I know you care, but life is more complicated. Learn from it. And to me, that means a lot of different things. It means that be there for somebody in their darkest hour. Be there for people, not only with your words, but with your actions. And that's something that's gonna live with me forever. My sister was born in 1989, I believe. I remember I was in Florida when my sister was born. I was in the swimming pool. I was actually staying with my grandfather at the time. And my grandfather yells down the balcony, tu hermana nació, you know, and my sister was born in July, you know, 1989, was my first sibling. So I was super excited to have a little sister, you know. I was excited. I jumped out the pool, went upstairs. My biological father was never there. I found out later when I became a teenager, you know, my father was a drug dealer. He used to sell coke. I don't know if my mom knew, you know, I don't really know if my mom knew. There were days that he would call my mother and he would say, you know, I'm gonna pick Danny up. I'll be there at such and such time. Never showed up. And I could vividly remember waiting by the window. We lived on the 3rd floor, 632 Kennedy Boulevard. And I remember sitting at that window just looking out, waiting for my dad to show up, and he would never show up, never show up. The few times that he did show up, it wasn't even him, it was somebody that he would send to pick me up. And my mother trusted my dad would allow me to go with them. I found out later that those were people that he was selling drugs to, or people that would buy drugs off my dad. As a favor, they would come and pick me up, which is crazy if you think about it, because it could have put me in harm's way. It could have put me in a crazy situation. I remember one story, my father picked me up. He was like, I think he had a beeper. He got a beep, he made a phone call, he gets back in the car, he's like, you know, hey son, listen, I'm gonna leave you here on Central Avenue. I'll never forget, it was on Central and Bowers. And he goes, I'm gonna be right back, wait right here. I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. My father never came back. I really didn't think nothing of it. I was just walking up and down Central Avenue, waiting for my father to come back. You know, it affected me with my father, my biological dad, because I always yearned for that relationship. I always yearned for the love of my father. You know, everybody always told me I look just like him, you know, I act just like him. My mother always told me, and still tells me to this day, that she can't believe it, how much I act like my father, because I never grew up with him. I always tried to build a relationship with him, but I just felt like the relationship wasn't, you know, the love wasn't reciprocated. And once I had my daughters, you know, I have 3 beautiful daughters. Once I had my daughters and I saw that he wasn't showing the love and the attention to them either, I mean, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. At that point, I was like, man, it ain't worth it. It was like, I gotta move on with my life and focus on my family and focus on being the father that he wasn't to me. Mother was always a good mother. Me and my mother, you know, we bumped heads later on in life when I was 16 years old, and she had married this guy who was verbally abusive to all of us, mostly her, and he was also a raging alcoholic. Bought my mother a house, bought us a house in Staten Island when I was about 15 years old. We moved over there, and it was hell, man. You know, we got there, he didn't give me keys to the house. He would lock food in the basement. A lot of days of yelling, screaming. You know, one time, you know, he held it against me because I told him, yo, you ain't my father. You know, you can't tell me what to do. You can't be yelling at me because you ain't my father. And that was it. It was a wrap from there, you know what I'm saying? So at the age of 16, you know, me and my mom's ex-husband, we got into a physical altercation. At that point, I was done. I was miserable. You know, I didn't feel protected. I didn't feel safe. So I ended up going back and forth between Daisy, my cousin Daisy's house, and staying in Bayonne, back and forth, you know, until I eventually signed out of high school in Newdorp High School, because in New York at the time you could sign yourself out at the age of 16. I signed myself out of high school, dropped out, and I became technically homeless at that point.